Listen, it's a treat to be here, not just because I miss my old friend, because now that he's focused on the work he's doing here and his connections to the community, he doesn't get to Ottawa, but nearly enough. But with the atmosphere in Ottawa these days, I can't say I particularly blame him. But one of the things I was really happy about, seeing Anthony, first of all, just happy because I was seeing him, but I was also happy because everywhere I went today with him, people were happy to see him too. To see the kind of impact he still has. The strength of the connections he has with this community, the passion he has for this community. Passion that is undiminished, and he's taking advantage of by spending more time working here and helping out the community of North Bay and the riding of Nipissing to Miskaming do better in general. Is the silver lining in a cloud that is frustrating for us to not have him among us. But it's time we talked about real things. We're all Liberals in here. We have to admit that the well-worn definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. We've had a very clear path over the past dozen or so years. In the year 2000, the Liberal Party had about 172 MPs in that election. That's what we received. The election after that, 2004, we dropped down to about 135. The election after that, we dropped down to about 100. The election after that, it was 75. The election after that, it was 35. It's a straight line, people. The next election, if we continue in that way, we'll be down to 1 seat. Because I will win that many. But that's not good enough. For the past dozen or so years, the Liberal Party has been failing in its most fundamental obligation, that of connecting with Canadians. We've been taking things for granted. We've been ceding ground both to the left and to the right, and we have two very cunning political parties that have worked against us and are using the system very well. So we find ourselves in this position right now, where people are regularly writing the obituaries of the Liberal Party, talking about how irrelevant we are. We look around, and we gather ourselves in rooms like this, and we smile. Et il y a des gens qui me posent la question, mais pourquoi vous souriez encore? Pourquoi êtes-vous si optimiste pour l'avenir du Parti libéral du Canada? Et je réponds très simplement, parce que j'ai confiance dans les Canadiens. Et j'ai confiance dans les gens qui croient au Parti libéral et dans les gens qui croient dans un meilleur avenir pour le Canada. Canada is not a polarized country. We are not a country that has thrived on left versus right. That is not the times when we were on one side or the other that we have achieved the great things that Canada has achieved. It has been when we were focused on getting along, where we've been focused on finding common ground, compromising, accommodating each other, understanding that we're a country strong not in spite of our differences, but because of those differences. And that's something that's been completely forgotten in politics these days. We have right now two parties in Ottawa that are flip sides of the same coin. Whether you look at Mr. Mulcair or Mr. Harper, you see strong, grumpy, top-down, forceful, professional politicians who will do whatever they can to win. And depending on your leanings, you can pick the one on the left or you can pick the one on the right. But the reality is that both of them, anchored in ideologies of the left or the right, are trying to move towards the center succeeding to a certain extent, which is squeezing out the Liberal Party. That's what all the pundits are saying, that's what everyone's saying. And this has worked very effectively, because right now the cynicism around politics is not about voting for someone. Because the way Canadians look at politicians is not necessarily in the most favorable light these days. So Canadians are caught in a rut of voting against. Park yourself on the left, and you vote against the reactionary capitalists of the right. Or you park yourself on the right, and you vote against the hippie socialists of the left. And that works perfectly fine for Thomas Mulcair and Stephen Harper. Because Mr. Harper, it's well known, parks himself to the left, puts a big X on the Atlantic provinces and on Quebec, and fights over Ontario. And Mr. Mulcair, with his latest strategy, has demonstrated that he's parking himself in the eastern provinces and Quebec, and voting and standing and fighting against the western provinces and their economies, and planning on taking Ontario. But you know what? We Liberals know something that they have forgotten. Canadians want politicians and political parties that bring us together, not drive us apart. Who have figured out how to live in a land that is far too big, far too empty, and far too cold for far too many months of the year, to allow ourselves to be pitted ones against the others. Because we get by having strong communities, by leaning on each other, by leaning on our neighbors, by being there for each other, by understanding that we do well when we pull together. That is the story of Canada. That is the story of the Liberal Party of Canada. But don't you ever say, the way we can when we get full of ourselves as a party, as has happened in the past, and toss around ridiculous phrases like natural governing party. We ever say that again. When we do, we say things like, with Medicare, with the Charter, with bilingualism, with multiculturalism, the Liberal Party shaped Canada. No, don't applaud, because that's not true. Canada shaped the Liberal Party. We were created by these people who see big, who are willing to step and willing to build a fairer, more just society. These are the things that we stand for. And right now we have two parties in the House of Commons that are trying to convince Canadians that we should be less. That we in one part of the country are different from people in other parts of the country. That people in cities are different from people in towns, or different from people in remote areas. People who speak French are different from those who speak English. Different religions, different backgrounds, different histories, different cultures somehow are exploitable for electoral gain. Canadians don't want that. We had a great example in Alberta just a month ago when, boy oh boy, were they ready for a change. 40 years of Tory rule in Alberta, and they wanted a change. All the polls said so. The Wild Rose was headed to a majority. And then people realized the Wild Rose Party is a party of extremes, a party of polarization, of strategic divisions, of the same old, right-wing, regressive politics that are exclusionary and downright mean and therefore un-Canadian. And Albertans said, hey, that's not us. And they stood up and they said, yes, we want to change, but not at any cost. And they brought in the closest thing to a Liberal government the Albertans will ever have, in Alison Redford's truly progressive Conservatives. Now, we are a country that needs to get it right. And that the other two parties function by mobilizing a narrow ideological base. Regardless of the fact that they are trying to move towards the center, because that's where the votes are, they play to their reform base on the right or their aggressive union socialist base on the left. And what happens when you play to that small base is, listen, those groups of people can generate a lot of money and are very interested in certain causes. But a party that is not ideological, but value-based, a party that opens itself up to all Canadians and tries not to cross off any region or any particular subgroup from its potential voter list. A party that wants to appeal to everyone and appeal to the mainstream doesn't get to energize a narrow band of people. It has to convince the majority of Canadians who are, yes, interested in politics, but tired of it, who are focused on their jobs, on their children, on their families, on their future, and don't see politics as being really able to provide much. Those are the ones we need to get out to. Those are the ones, the people we need to convince. We have to convince your neighbors who would never show up at an event for any party like this tonight that they can get involved, that they can shape the world, that they can demand more and expect more from their leadership, whether it be political or community or business. And that's why it's so important that last January the Liberal Party took a revolutionary step, one that no other party would do or is even capable of doing. We opened up the Liberal Party to supporters. And more than that, all of you here, by being here tonight, are pretty much members of the Liberal Party. But we are saying we need supporters. We need to tap into those 2.5 million people who in the last election voted for the Liberal Party, even in our worst election ever. There are people who call themselves liberals, perhaps, who believe in liberal principles, but don't see themselves being labeled as liberals. So we're offering free status as supporters of the Liberal Party to anyone who says, yeah, I vote Liberal, and no, I'm not a member of a political party. And we're going to give those people the right to vote for our next leader. Now, we've already, last time in Vancouver, we brought forward one member, one vote. And we're already going a step beyond that. One supporter, one vote. Now, why would we do that? Well, for two reasons. First of all, if we are going to connect with Canadians, we have to reach out to them and involve them. The Liberal Party sits at around 50,000 members right now. The NDP sits at about 100,000 because they just had a leadership race. Conservatives are about the same thing. There's a very, very small fraction of Canadians who actually choose to be involved in political parties. Well, we need to, instead of being satisfied with a polarized base like the other two have, we need to make it easier for hardworking. And in the last election, Canadians didn't necessarily choose the Conservative Party to be their majority. They just wanted someone to get a majority, please, because we're so sick and tired of the constant hassle of minority governments. Well, unfortunately, Canadians are learning their lesson right now. What it means to turn around and tell the party that for the first time in the history of Westminster democracy, going back 800 years or so, the party that was found for the first time ever by a parliament to have been in contempt of parliament, have a government held in contempt of parliament. That was the trigger for the last election. C'est du jamais vu. Mr. Harper sort of shrugged it off and said, oh, well, of course they voted against us, they don't like us. Well, we have contempt for them. And all Canadians said, well, you know what, we have contempt for the whole bunch of you. And that played into Mr. Harper's hands. Because once you say to a party that was found in contempt of Parliament, that's okay, we don't care about the contempt, we'll give you a majority anyway. Well, of course, they feel they have carte blanche to pull off election fraud. Of course they continue to and increase their capacity to shut down debates, to drive committee meetings into secret, to abuse Parliament and parliamentary privilege in any which way, because they've seen the consequence for the most contemptuous behavior that any government has ever had towards a parliament in the history of parliaments. The consequence was a majority. So right now you have Canadians waking up to the kind of monster they have created or allowed to be created. What happens when we allow ourselves to be pitted, one region against another, one identity against another? Well, what happens when we allow a party to play to our fears and insecurities and focus on protecting us from the worst amongst ourselves, as opposed to what the Liberal Party always tries to do, which is to try and play up and build in the ideal for what is best amongst us as a people. And over the next 3 years, the tone put forward by Stephen Harper and Thomas Mulcair is going to frustrate more and more Canadians. And if they have to, they will hold their nose and, in a record low turnout, in 2015, we'll pick one or the other. Unless they have an alternative. Unless they have a party that is not based on ideology, but on strong core values. Values of openness, respect, equality, compassion. A willingness to work hard, but a desire to be there for our neighbors when they fall in times of trouble. Those are Canadian values. Values of saying east, west, north, south, urban, rural, you're all Canadians, and you all have value. And whether or not you vote for us, we will govern for you. A party that remembers that it's not enough to make small dreams for the country. That we have the most extraordinary country in the world. And the Canadians need to be called upon to step up. A party that remembers that having a vision for this country is important for the country. And that that's what people want. If we pull together and stand proud on our values and look for reasonable solutions and base ourselves on science and best practices and looking for sometimes more difficult but more intelligent solutions and not taking the easy road, Canadians will respond. We need to be bold. We need to be true to ourselves.